Your foot is pressing against a flat surface. Shoe, slipper, floor, whatever is beneath you feels uniform, featureless, identical pressure across the entire sole. Beneath that surface, 200,000 nerve endings are firing at near zero. More mechanoreceptors per square centimeter than anywhere on your hand. 4 distinct receptor types, each tuned to a different physical parameter: pressure, vibration, texture, stretch, all of them detecting nothing. A sensory organ as dense and sophisticated as your fingertips, built to read the ground the way a hand reads Braille, has been running dark. 16 hours a day. For the last 50 years. Balance problems that arrived after 55, the unsteadiness on uneven ground, the hand reaching for the handrail, the hesitation at the top of the stairs did not begin in your legs. They did not begin in your inner ear. They began in the sole of your foot, in a sensory organ designed to be the fastest input to your postural control system, sealed inside a cushioned chamber receiving silence since you were 3 years old. And the cortical territory in your brain that once processed those signals, the map, your somatosensory cortex built to interpret what the foot was reporting, physically shrank. Not from age, from the absence of anything to interpret. What those 200,000 nerve endings were built to detect, what 50 years of shoes did to the brain that reads them, and what happens measurably within days when the foot finally touches a surface that speaks back. In the sole of your foot lies the most densely innervated weight-bearing surface in the body, a sensory sheet with receptor density rivaling the palm of your hand. 4 mechanoreceptor types occupy different depths of the plantar skin, and each one detects a different dimension of ground contact. Meissner's corpuscles sit in the superficial dermis, 40 to 60 per square centimeter across the arch and ball. They respond to light, touch, and texture at frequencies between 10 and 50 Hz. When a barefoot contacts grass, every blade bending under body weight generates oscillations in this frequency range. Each blade produces a separate signal: angle, pressure, spring back, all encoded in a flutter that ripples across the sole. On a flat shoe insole, the Meissner's population reports one continuous value: nothing is happening. Pacinian corpuscles sit deeper in the subcutaneous tissue and periosteum, the connective layer wrapping the bone. They detect high-frequency vibration between 100 and 300 Hz. When a bare heel strikes soil, micro-vibrations propagate through the ground and into the skeletal structure, reporting surface density and compliance, whether the ground beneath is hard rock, soft loam, wet clay, or shifting sand. A cushioned shoe sole absorbs these vibrations before they reach the receptor. For 50 years, the Pacinian corpuscles have been sitting in silence. Merkel cells occupy the dermal-epidermal junction. They map sustained pressure and spatial contour, the precise topography of whatever your foot is standing on. On a forest floor, every root, depression, and embedded stone is rendered in high spatial resolution, a tactile photograph of the terrain beneath each step. On a flat floor inside a shoe, the entire Merkel population reports a single uniform value: flat. Ruffini endings detect skin stretch, the direction and magnitude of shear forces as the foot loads, rolls, and pushes off during each stride. On uneven terrain, the stretch patterns are complex and continuously variable, providing real-time data about the angle, stability, and movement of the surface. In a rigid shoe on a level floor, shear variation drops to nearly zero. That is the foot you are standing on. A sensory organ with 4 parallel data channels, 200,000 individual sensors, and a bandwidth that rivals anything in the human body. Perhaps you have held a tennis ball and felt its texture without looking: the fuzz, the seams, the slight give of the rubber beneath your fingers. You're handed that through Meissner's, Pacinian, Merkel, and Ruffini receptors, the very types that line the sole of your foot in equal or greater density. Your foot can read the ground with the resolution your hand reads objects. The density is not accidental. Your hand reads objects because it manipulates them. It needs to know what it is holding. Your foot reads the ground because it is the only contact point between your entire body mass and the surface of the earth. Every other primate distributes weight across 4 contact points. You distribute yours across 2 and frequently across 1 during the swing phase of each stride, when your full weight balances on a single foot for roughly 400 milliseconds. A sensory organ at that contact point is a structural requirement for bipedal balance on terrain that changes with every step. Every child knows what grass feels like underfoot. Every child knows the cold shock of a puddle, the prickling of gravel, the give of sand. That child was running a sensory organ at full capacity without knowing it existed. Something happened between then and now, and it was not aging. Shoes happened. Specifically, modern shoes happened. For most of human history, footwear was minimal, thin leather, or woven plant fiber, enough to prevent cuts, flexible enough to let the foot bend and feel the ground beneath it. Roman sandals, moccasins, medieval turn shoes, all of them thin enough that the plantar surface received real signal from the terrain. In the 1970s, the modern cushioned running shoe arrived: thick foam midsoles, rigid heel counters, elevated heels, arch support built into the structure. Comfort became the engineering objective, and comfort, in shoe design, means absorbing the very signals your receptors were built to receive. Every advance in cushioning technology was an advance in sensory deprivation. The thicker the sole, the quieter the foot. The more supportive the arch, the weaker the intrinsic muscles became. The shoe got more comfortable. And nobody measured what was being lost, because nobody thought of the sole as a sensory organ in the first place. Across the top of your skull, running ear to ear, lies the somatosensory cortex, a strip of brain tissue that maps bodily sensation. This cortex does not allocate processing territory equally. It allocates by input volume. Your hand, which sends dense continuous data through its high receptor concentrations, commands a disproportionately large cortical territory. Your trunk, which sends sparse signals, commands a small one. This is the cortical homunculus, the distorted body map drawn not by physical size but by information flow. Cortical territory dedicated to the foot is determined entirely by how much data arrives. In populations that walk barefoot daily, studied in indigenous communities and among habitual barefoot runners, the foot's somatosensory representation is large. Substantial processing capacity is dedicated to interpreting the dense, complex signals arriving from 200,000 plantar receptors, encountering variable terrain with every step. In populations that have worn cushioned shoes on flat surfaces for 5 decades, the foot's cortical territory has measurably shrunk. This is cortical remapping through sensory deprivation, a phenomenon also documented in the visual cortex after sight loss and in the auditory cortex after hearing loss. Your brain does not maintain processing infrastructure for signals that stop arriving. Cortical real estate that once belonged to the foot has been quietly reassigned to other inputs. Your brain's map of the foot contracted because the shoe silenced it. Decades of uniform input read as no input at all. Now, functional magnetic resonance imaging confirms this: directly measurable differences in cortical activation between habitually shod and habitually barefoot populations. A brain that has received shoe-filtered foot signals for 5 decades processes plantar input through a smaller, less responsive cortical region than a brain that receives barefoot signals daily. If you have ever lost a skill, you stopped practicing a language you once spoke fluently, a musical instrument you once played without thinking, the mechanism is familiar. Cortical territory that processed the skill was reallocated when the input stopped arriving. And what that silence costs reaches further than you would expect, because the foot is not a secondary balance sensor. It is the primary one. Most people believe balance lives in the inner ear. The vestibular system contributes, but plantar cutaneous input, the signal from mechanoreceptors in the sole of your foot, is the dominant contributor to postural stability during standing and walking. Plantar input drove postural correction faster than any other sensory channel, as Kennedy and Inglis established in the Journal of Physiology in 2002. Vibration applied to the plantar surface alone could induce controlled postural sway with no vestibular involvement at all, as Cavonautius and colleagues confirmed independently in Brain the previous year. Your feet were driving the balance system directly. Here is why speed matters. Plantar receptors detect postural sway at the ground surface, the first physical contact point between your body and the earth, and transmit the correction signal through the tibial nerve to the spinal cord in approximately 35 to 40 milliseconds. Your vestibular system detects head position change and transmits through the vestibulocochlear nerve in approximately 80 to 100 milliseconds. By the time your inner ear registers that you are tilting, your feet have already detected the sway and initiated the correction. Your sole is the first responder. Your inner ear is the backup. Well, consider what that means if the first responder has been receiving no signal for 5 decades. When the primary input is muffled, cushioned soles absorbing vibration, flat floors eliminating contour, rigid shoe walls restricting stretch, the postural control system shifts from plantar-led to vision-led. Vision is slower than the plantar pathway. Vision degrades in dim light. Vision cannot operate with your eyes closed. If you feel unsteady on a gravel path, stumble in a dim hallway, or grab the shower wall when you close your eyes to rinse shampoo, you are experiencing a postural system that lost its fastest input decades ago and has been running on its slowest backup ever since. You can test this in 10 seconds. Stand on one leg with your eyes open, manageable. Now close your eyes. The wobble that arrives immediately is the sound of a balance system that has lost its primary data source and is reaching for a visual signal that just went dark. Perhaps you have been told your balance problems are age-related or vestibular. That is half the diagnosis. Vestibular sensitivity does decline with age, but the faster, higher resolution balance input was lost to the shoe, not to the calendar. Your balance system has been running on backup for so long that backup feels normal. You now know that the foot is a sensory organ with 4 receptor types, that the brain shrank its map of that organ through decades of sensory deprivation, and that the foot, not the inner ear, is the body's fastest balance input. Here the question changes. It is no longer about what shoes took away. It is about what happens when 3 kinds of decline converge in a single decade and whether any of it comes back. 3 age-related changes arrive together, and understanding their convergence explains why falls cluster so heavily after 55. Light touch receptor density in the sole decreases approximately 1% per year after 20, as documented in the Journal of Neurophysiology in 2018 by Strzelkowski and colleagues, who mapped mechanoreceptor distribution across the human plantar surface with a precision no prior study had achieved. By 70, the foot has lost roughly half its Meissner's corpuscle population. An organ that could once detect a single grass blade bending under body weight is losing resolution every year, and it has been losing it since before you noticed. Simultaneously, the cortical territory processing whatever signal the foot still sends has been contracting for 5 decades of shoe wearing. Remapping that began when a 3-year-old's foot was first sealed inside a shoe has been compounding silently across an entire adult lifetime, a shrinking organ sending signals to a shrinking map, and the motor response that closes the loop gets slower. Postural sway correction in older adults takes measurably longer than in younger adults, as Perry and colleagues reported in the Journal of Gerontology in 2008. Every step in the sequence, detect sway, transmit signal, process in cortex, generate motor command, activate ankle stabilizer, requires more time at 65 than at 25. Every link in the correction chain has degraded. These 3 changes do not announce themselves individually. They converge. A foot losing receptors sends its diminished signal to a cortex that has downsized, which sends its correction to muscles that respond late. The stumble that would have been caught at 40, the curb edge, the rug corner, the wet bathroom tile, now arrives faster than the correction can travel. Falls are the result, the leading cause of injury-related death in adults over 65, more fatal in this age group than automobile collisions. A fall at 72 is not the fall you remember from 35. At 35, you caught yourself, stood up, brushed off your knees, and carried on. At 72, a fall breaks a hip. A broken hip means surgery, hospital, 6 weeks of immobility, blood clot risk, pneumonia risk, and a mortality rate of 20 to 30% within the first year. 1 in 3 adults over 65 who break a hip never return to independent living. The fall that begins with a missed signal from the sole of the foot ends, for many, with a transfer to assisted care. The distance between a functioning plantar receptor and a wheelchair is shorter than most people imagine. Standard clinical responses target the downstream links, balance exercises for the muscles, vestibular rehabilitation for the inner ear. Both help. But neither addresses the upstream failure, the 200,000 nerve endings that were supposed to detect the sway before any muscle needed to fire, sealed inside a sole that absorbed the signal before it arrived. Every fall prevention program in every hospital in every country begins with the muscles and the inner ear. Almost none begins with the foot. And the foot was always the first link in the chain. My morning routine now starts on the back step, shoes off. Feet on whatever the garden offers. 35 milliseconds from sole to spinal cord, the fastest postural correction in the body, firing into a cushion every morning without reaching the receptors it was aimed at. 5 minutes barefoot before coffee, every morning since. Here is what happens in the first 30 seconds on grass. When your bare foot contacts an irregular natural surface, the receptor array that has been receiving near silence activates across all 4 channels simultaneously. Meissner's corpuscles detect blade texture and surface movement. Pacinian corpuscles detect micro-vibrations propagating through the ground from each footfall. Merkel cells map the contour beneath each square centimeter of the sole. Ruffini endings register complex shear patterns as the foot adjusts to terrain that is not flat. Signal density, arriving at the somatosensory cortex, spikes from near zero to full input, a volume increase that the cortex has not received in decades. And the cortex does not ignore this. Cortical plasticity, the brain's capacity to reallocate processing territory in response to incoming data, begins responding within minutes of novel sensory stimulation. Remapping that took 50 years to establish starts reversing from the first barefoot session. For your somatosensory cortex, the shift is abrupt. Neurons that have been firing at minimal background rates for decades, receiving nothing but the flat, uniform signal of a shoe insole, suddenly receive structured, multi-channel input from a surface that varies under every square centimeter of the sole. The cortical territory is reduced but functional. It responds immediately. What you feel as a sudden aliveness in the soles of your feet is the cortex processing an input density it has not handled in decades, using architecture that atrophied but did not die. Your toes spread involuntarily. The intrinsic foot muscles, weakened by decades of shoe support, as the walking discussion described, receive the surface variability and respond by widening the base of support. A unified muscular architecture was identified in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2015 by McKeon and colleagues, who named it the foot core system, the infrastructure that maintains the arch through active engagement rather than passive shoe structure. On a variable surface, the foot core activates and the arch lifts under its own power. And then, the balance shifts. Your postural control system, receiving its designed input for the first time in decades, transitions from visual backup to plantar primary. Uneven ground that would have felt threatening in shoes feels not easy, but readable. Your foot is telling your brain what the ground is doing, and your brain is responding with corrections it has not generated in years. Perhaps you have watched a child run barefoot across a garden without hesitation, no reaching for support, no looking down, no planning each step. That child's postural system is running on primary. Yours has been running on backup since roughly the age that child started wearing shoes to school. Now the cold arrives. And this operates through a completely different neural pathway. Wet morning grass dew covered, between 5 and 7 drops the plantar skin temperature by 4 to 6 degrees Celsius in the first 3 seconds of contact. Cold receptors embedded in the plantar dermis TRPM8 channels, tuned to temperatures below roughly 25 degrees, send afferent signals through the tibial nerve to the brainstem. The sympathetic-parasympathetic oscillation, the cold exposure discussion described, operates here through the sole of the foot, the sharp spike, the rebound that settles heart rate below baseline without submerging anything. The dual input is what makes wet grass unique. Maximum mechanoreceptor activation for the postural system and cold-triggered autonomic cycling for the nervous system, arriving through one surface simultaneously. Heart rate variability, the metric the oscillation lifts, is one of the strongest predictors of all-cause mortality in adults over 65. An intervention that raises it costs nothing and operates through physics the body already understands. That alertness you feel, sudden, specific, more immediate than caffeine, is 2 systems activating at once, 200,000 receptors firing after hours of silence, and autonomic cycling triggered through the densest thermoreceptor field in the lower body. If you have ever stepped out of a warm house into cold morning air and felt something shift, a sharpening of attention, in a sense that the body woke up in a way the alarm clock could not produce, wet grass on bare feet delivers that shift through a receptor field dense enough to make it immediate. The feeling lives in your nervous system, and the nervous system responds, whether or not you expect it to. Your foot is fluent in a language nobody has spoken to it in 50 years. Well, the question the physics raises next is whether that language can be spoken again, whether 50 years of cortical remapping and receptor decline actually reverse, or whether the window closed decades ago, faster than you would expect. Cortical plasticity does not require decades to operate in the recovery direction. When novel sensory input arrives at a deprived cortical region, the first changes are rapid synaptic connections that weaken through decades of disuse begin strengthening within hours. The pathways are dormant, not destroyed. Within 3 to 5 days of consistent stimulation, cortical activation in the relevant somatosensory region increases measurably on functional imaging. By the end of the first week, cortical territory that was reassigned to other inputs starts returning not fully, not to the map a 3-year-old carried before shoes, but enough that your cortex is processing plantar input with a responsiveness it has not shown in years. The plasticity that shrank the map can also redraw it, and the recovery direction is faster than the degradation was, because the underlying neural architecture was pruned for disuse, not damaged by disease. Your brain follows the data, and when data arrives from the foot again, the cortex responds. Significant improvements in foot position awareness and balance confidence appeared within weeks, when elderly subjects transitioned to minimal footwear, as Robbins and colleagues demonstrated in Medicine and Science in Sports, and Vesson, Exercise in 1995. Those improvements exceeded what conventional balance exercise programs of equal duration achieved. Balance exercises targeted the muscles downstream. Changing the footwear targeted the sensory input upstream. Restoring the input mattered more than strengthening the output. That finding is worth pausing on. Decades of balance decline attributed to aging. Treated with exercises, accepted as irreversible, partially reversed in weeks. Not through medication or surgery or a new exercise, through thinner shoes. Intrinsic foot muscles atrophied from 5 decades of arch support performing their function for them respond to barefoot, loading the way any skeletal muscle responds to progressive resistance. Contractile capacity begins rebuilding within the first week. Your arch lifts higher under its own engagement. Your toes grip with increasing confidence. Your foot operates as a dynamic, responsive structure rather than a passive block at the bottom of the leg. I bought thinner-soled shoes after sitting with Strzalkowski's receptor density data, not minimalist running shoes, not a trend purchase. Just soles thin enough to let ground vibration reach the Pacinian corpuscles that had been waiting for a signal. Pavement becomes legible through 3 millimeters of sole texture, gradient, the grain of the concrete beneath each step. Through 2 centimeters of cushion, that pavement had been mute for years. Here's the protocol, and it requires nothing beyond a door and a patch of grass. 5 minutes of barefoot walking every morning. The surface must be natural and irregular grass, soil, or sand. If you have no garden, a gravel path or a patch of park works. A flat indoor floor provides temperature change, but no contour variability, and the postural system needs both. The unpredictable terrain that forces real-time receptor processing and the thermal stimulus that cycles the autonomic nervous system. Start with 2 minutes. Your intrinsic foot muscles will fatigue sooner than you expect. They have been architecturally supported for decades and have weakened in proportion. Add 1 minute per week. By the end of the first week, the morning stiffness eases. Fascia in the sole connective tissue that depends on mechanical pumping to stay hydrated begins receiving the compression and release it has been missing. The plantar fascia wakes up along with the receptors it is embedded in. By the 3rd week, the change you notice will not be in your feet. It will be in the confidence, the willingness to step onto uneven ground without reaching for something solid. That shift is the postural control system switching from backup to primary, engaging the 35 millisecond plantar pathway instead of the slower visual channel it has depended on for decades. By the 2nd month, if you have been consistent, the proprioceptive recalibration becomes visible in daily life, not just on the grass but on the pavement, the stairs, the gravel path you used to avoid. Ground that once felt uncertain begins to feel readable. The foot is sending data again, and the cortex is listening. People describe it differently. Some say the ground feels closer, some say their feet feel wider, Some say they simply stopped thinking about where to step. All of them are describing the same thing, a balance system running on primary for the first time in decades. For anyone with peripheral neuropathy, diabetes-related nerve damage, or active foot wounds, discuss this with your physician before beginning. Reduced sensation from nerve disease is a different mechanism from reduced input from shoes, and the approach requires medical guidance. 200,000 nerve endings did not die. Your cortex did not permanently lose their territory. Your balance system did not forget how to use the foot. Every receptor is intact. The cortex is plastic. The postural pathways are wide and waiting for a signal the shoe prevented from arriving. Tomorrow morning the grass will be wet. Dew settles heaviest between 5 and 8, every blade carrying moisture that will drop the plantar surface 4 to 6 degrees in the first 3 seconds of contact. 200,000 nerve endings in each sole, quiet since you took your shoes off last night, will contact an irregular, cold, textured surface and fire across all 4 channels for the first time in years. Your postural system will engage on primary instead of the visual backup it has been running for decades. Your toes will spread, your arch will lift. Cold will arrive sharp, immediate, and the autonomic rebound will follow. And your brain will begin redrawing a map it shrank because the signals stopped receiving input at a density it has not processed since you were a child running barefoot across a garden without thinking about it. Nobody needs to tell you what grass feels like. Your feet remember, they have been waiting to be asked. 5 minutes, barefoot, on the wet grass. Tomorrow morning,